Can you keep a secret?
Changing hearts and minds.
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 Welcome to Change Your POV podcast. You're listening to Changing Hearts and Minds, a show about reviving the warrior spirit and remembering the past to improve our future. I'm your host, Jeff Adamick. Let's get this party started.
Ladies and gentlemen, am I totally screwed or what? You're funny.
I want to discuss all this behavior.
Let me out of here!
Comrades, this is your captain. It is an honor to speak to you today, and I'm honored to be sailing with you on the maiden voyage of our motherland's most recent achievement. And once more, we play our dangerous game. A game of chess against our old adversary, the American Navy. For 40 years, your fathers before you and your older brothers played this game and played it well. But today, the game is different. We have the advantage. It reminds me of the heady days of Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin, when the world trembled at the sound of our rockets. Only will tremble again at the sound of our silence. The order is, engage the silent drive.
Aye, sir. Balance control. Open out the doors.
Yes, open all the doors.
Welcome, guys, to part 2 of the Silent Service. This is the second part of a 2-part episode where I am joined by frequent guest Andrew McDowell, and we are talking about the history of submarines, submarine warfare, and just some really cool stories that are out there about submarines. If you remember correctly, at the end of the last episode, we had started off with the beginning of submarines as a military tool, and actually submarines as a tool at all. And we moved all the way up until the end of World War II. So now, without further delay, as you guys have been waiting patiently, let's get right into it. We're going to pick up right at the end of World War II, moving into the Cold War, and all up the way till modern time history of submarine warfare. Here it is, Silent Service Part 2.
Steady as you go.
All ahead 1/3, steady eye, sir.
Make your depth 150 feet. Zero bubble, up slow and silent to launch depth.
Up slow and silent to launch depth. Aye, aye, Captain.
World War II ends, and there's a million stories of World War. Like we said earlier, we can only talk about so many of them, and the Japanese ships, submarines in Pearl Harbor, and the sinking of the USS Indianapolis are two of the most ones you can look up and be confident that it's not conjecture, because there's so much stuff out there that it's a submariner is just telling a story that only him and the guys on his sub know.
Yep.
So we wanted to keep things as accurate as possible on this show. So moving on to post World War II, the Cold War. So the same technology that would bring an end to World War II, the nuclear technology, would be the spearhead of all submarine activity afterwards. The advent of nuclear-powered submarines in the 1950s brought about a major change in strategic thinking about submarine warfare. These boats could operate faster, deeper, and had much longer endurance. They could be larger and so became missile launching platforms. In response to the attack submarine became more important, particularly in regards to its postulated role as a hunter-killer. The U.S. also used nuclear submarines as radar pickets for a while. So they would just send them out there, surface, and you would just retransmit these signals to somebody else, and kind of like a long-range friggin' communication system. There's also been major advances in sensors and weapons. And during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union played what was described as a cat-and-mouse game of detecting and even trailing enemy submarines. And this became pretty much the storyline of submarine warfare throughout the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union had become two of the most powerful submarine forces on the planet. And they were one of only portions of both militaries who actively participated in active operations of one another. So the U.S. military and the Soviet military were both at odds because of the Cold War, but the submarines and intelligence gathering operations were the only kinetic operations that really occurred against each other. So other than the spy stuff that went on, the submarines were the only active, engaging and interacting warfare activity that happened between the Soviet Union and the United States. Not necessarily direct combat, but they did track and play hide and seek games with one another throughout the entirety of the Cold War. By mid 1950s, the Soviets had discarded any intentions of waging an anti-shipping campaign in a new battle of the Atlantic. So the U.S. Navy's deployment of a carrier-based nuclear strike capability in the early 1950s and the deployment of Polaris missile submarines in the early 1960s had led to a defense against nuclear strikes from the sea becoming the Soviet Navy's highest priority mission. They also created their own launch capability ships. Don't get it twisted. We weren't the only aggressors. New surface ships and submarines were constructed, as well as land-based naval and subsequent Soviet Air Force aircraft were justified on the basis of destroying U.S. aircraft carriers and missile submarines as they approached the Soviet homeland.
So from the early 1960s, the U.S. reconnaissance satellites could identify Soviet submarines being prepared for sea. Once cued for such sources, the spy satellite networks and passive buoys employed off the in the North Sea, off the coast of Norway, Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom, would then track the Soviet subs going to sea. You can make an assumption that similar networks in the Far East were also tracking subs and using similar intelligence sources to keep track of these Soviet subs that Jeff was talking about before, so that we could know where they were, so we could follow them, but also so that if there was a first strike nuclear attack by the Soviets, we could judge where the missiles were coming from with some accuracy and hopefully either interdict them before they could launch more or retaliate directly against those that launched nukes at us. And this wasn't a unique thing that the United States did by itself. The Soviets had the same type of information collecting, maybe not as technologically advanced, but the same type of thing. Both the U.S. and Soviets created nuclear power subs eventually that would also be able to deliver nuclear weapons. One of the first ones was launched in the town that I went to Connecticut. I went to school out of New London, Connecticut, and that was a major base where these subs would come in to refit and resupply. Both belligerents spent billions upon billions of dollars on their fleets of subs and anti-submarine warfare operations. And this is one of the things that basically resulted in the collapse of the Soviet Union. Flat out, we just outspent them. We spent them into the ground, and then they couldn't maintain.
Yeah, it's going down. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too far, but guys, just so you know politically, and this is something that's an absolute fact. Yes, we did participate in when people say, Star Wars of the 80s and Reagan's plan for Star Wars. Guys, you do realize that was all bullshit. That Reagan and his people created Star Wars as a method to force the Soviets to spend more money, to try to keep up with these complete bullshit friggin' things that we said we were building. And it assisted in the complete financial downfall. So that, we had actual money being spent in the subs that were being used, that they were actually trying to keep up with us, and the SOSUS networks that we had in the Atlantic were making it harder and harder for them to keep secret. But also we participated in methods of financial attacking by telling them that we had these lasers in space. So the Soviets were trying to keep up with this Space Force. Funny, we're back to Space Force again. They were trying to keep up with this Space Force that we didn't have. And maybe Trump right now is trying to imitate Reagan. He's doing a very poor job of it, if I may say so. But I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too much. I don't want to Trump bash on the show. But not the same as Reagan, buddy. You're not pulling it off.
It was an interesting time. I think one of the things that I really like about this period is that you see it reflected in modern television. If anybody's watched The Americans, you see them try to steal some of the Star Wars technology the Soviets just can't recreate what the Americans say they're trying to do.
Right, because they had a bunch of sci-fi guys sitting around making this shit up.
Yep, exactly.
But back to submarines. So yeah, so here's one of the interesting things, and before we get into some of the events and some of the tragedies that have occurred because of this push for submarine warfare, but things like the SOSUS networks, as you talked about, those radar buoys and underwater listening devices that were, around the world. They're everywhere. So we spent all this money and put all this stuff up, and it worked. It helped. We were able to track effectively to the boomer. They were able to identify specific ships by the sounds they made, and were able to name them. They each had different names, as we've talked about. If you guys remember back to the one show where I had one of my buddies on, and he used to be an aircraft radar guy on an anti-submarine aircraft back in the 80s, and he talked about how they would identify certain ships by the sounds they made, and they were one of his things that he talked about was how his aircraft identified a brand new sub that had come out and been launched, and no one had heard it before, and they were the first ones to identify it, and they would classify them by saying Yankee and then a number. So if you look online, you'll see all these Soviet air submarines, and then they'll say their designator is Yankee and a number system. Now, those numbering systems come from the identification of a specific sound that was different from any other sound that came. So they each had their own high frequency resolution sound that, all right, that's this ship right here. And you see that in Hunt for Red October. They talk about that. And a lot of that stuff is accurate as far as how they did it. But this was a big deal back in the during the Cold War. I think even the 70s and 80s probably the most, because that's when technology was at its highest, and it was something that was very, very important to both sides. So I want to talk about some of the famous incidents that occurred, specifically some ships and everything. And first, I want to talk about the USS Thresher, which U.S. Navy service number SSN 593. So the USS Thresher sank while conducting deep diving tests southeast of Cape Cod on 10 April 1963. The accident, which took the lives of all 129 men on board, remains the highest ever submarine death toll in history. The USS Thresher was the lead boat in a class of 3,700 nuclear-powered attack submarines. Thresher had sent distorted signals of minor problems to submarine rescue ship Skylark before sinking within a few minutes. The submarine was traveling at a depth of about 1,300 feet at the time of the accident. The Biscath Tris, working alongside with the oceanographic ship Miser and other vessels deployed in extensive underwater search, found the wreckage of the Thresher on the seafloor at a depth of 8,400 feet. A piping failure resulting in the loss of power was identified as a major cause of the accident. So this one was eventually marked as just an actual accident. Piping failure, which that means that the water piping inside of it bursted. It means it flooded one of the compartments, and loss of power led for them to just continue to sink, which sucks.
Yeah, and the piping isn't there just to bring fresh water around. Yeah. And these are nuclear subs, so the water gets pumped in to cool the nuclear
reactor. Yeah.
Yep.
So what's the next one that we have on that ship? And these two kind of go together. That's why I put them together.
So next up is the USS Scorpion, which is SSN 589. It sank 400 miles southwest of the Azores in the middle of the Atlantic while returning from a Mediterranean deployment in May of 1968. And unfortunately, all 99 crew perished in the accident. The Scorpion was a 3,500-ton skipjack class nuclear-powered attack sub, which was commissioned in 1960. So it was only about an 8-year-old sub. The Scorpion had its last reported position about 50 miles south of the Azores on 21 May, and no issues were suspected until it failed to report to Norfolk on the 27th of May. The U.S. Navy launched a search and rescue operation for the sub and would subsequently announce that the sub was presumed lost on the 5th of June, 1968. Eventually, a deep submergence vehicle launched from a research ship, the USNS Miser that Jeff referenced before, identified the remains of the Scorpion in October of 1968 at a depth of more than 10,000 feet below the surface. The accident is believed, and they haven't access to sub to confirm or deny this, is believed to have been caused by the inadvertent activation of a battery on one of the torpedoes or the torpedo detonating in its tube.
And when it says that identify the remains of the Scorpion in October of 1968, it's referring to identifying of the Scorpion that sank in October of 1968. So if you paying attention, as Andrew just noted, the USNS Miser, which was actually a civilian boat that was conscripted by the U.S. Navy, found both these submarines. The mission to locate these two submarines was classified for years, and the U.S. Navy just wanted to discover if foul play from the Soviets had anything to do with the two submarines sinking. Totally believe they also wanted to make sure that the nuclear payloads that were on these ships were probably secured and still in place, and they did. And even though the Navy kept this mission secret, every single person knows about it. And that's the one thing everyone writes, what are you talking about? You know about the mission to find these two subs, even when you didn't know there was a mission to find these two subs. And why I say that? Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who discovered the final resting place of the Titanic in 1982, the same year that the USNS Miser investigated the sites of the Scorpion and Thrasher sinkings. The reason why is because he details in an article about the operation that investigated both submarines that they found that he was on the mission on the USS Miser to find these two submarines, and things were found. They found those two submarines so quickly because of the technology that he had invented to search the ocean floor, that he had talked the Navy into letting him spend the rest of they had a month to launch this operation. They found those two ships in like the first 2 weeks. So now they had 2 weeks to play with. And he talked them into letting him go to the area that the Titanic had been sunk at, that they thought, because at this point they didn't know where the Titanic was, and search for the Titanic.
Now, 73 years after that tragedy, a team of American and French scientists reports that the wreck of the Titanic has been found. The scientists used remote-controlled scanners and TV cameras in special containers to withstand enormous pressures deep underwater. They found the Titanic more than 2 miles down in total darkness. They say most of it is in one piece.
And Robert Ballard, the guy who found the Titanic while using the spare time on this mission to locate the that he had after finding the Thrasher and the Scorpion to find the Titanic. And funny thing is there's a whole documentary following the discovery of the Titanic that you can see. It's a National Geographic Discovery, and they're on this ship and they're talking about being out in the ocean and they were about to quit, and then boom, they find the Titanic. Well, what they don't realize is those crews were on that boat while they were doing all the other stuff, and they couldn't report the finding of these two other Navy. I mean, at that time, when they reported that they found the Titanic, the Scorpion and the Thrasher sinkings were still considered unknown. They were still mysteries, and the final resting place of those two ships. And it wasn't for years before they said, yeah, we found the Scorpion and the Thrasher. But they didn't say that, hey, we found the Scorpion and the Thrasher in the same month that we found the Titanic, because we used that technology to find all three of them. That's something that a lot of people don't realize, is that Ballard was on a secret mission to find the Thrasher and the Scorpion when he found the Titanic.
Yeah, and I mean, the fact that it was all run together and frankly, that he was able to convince the Navy to let him, all right, well, mission accomplished. Yeah. Let's go and do this other thing that I want to do. Yeah. Was pretty impressive. I'd give it up to the Navy for having some insight, letting them do that, because they really... I mean, they did give him a cap. Hey, you got this much time, and then you've got to turn it in. And the funny thing is they picked up the Titanic within hours of him running out of his time to do this. It's crazy. It's crazy. I mean, it's sheer luck.
It is. But his technology was great.
And technology.
His sonar technology that he used to search the areas was pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Andrew, U.S. is not the only ones that have lost ships out there, right?
The Soviets have lost more than their fair share.
Right.
Specifically, I want to pivot to, actually, this is a more recent one, the K-141 Kursk. It sank in the Barents Sea on August 12th of the year 2000. It was an Oscar II class cruise missile submarine that was built and commissioned in 1994.
The Kursk was taking part in a naval exercise in the Arctic waters of the Barents Sea north of Norway when disaster struck. After disappearing from radar, she was found on the seabed in 150 meters of water. Her nuclear reactors were shut down, leaving the crew with just a few days of air.
The Kursk was one of 30 vessels that took place in a series of exercises called Summer X. Basically, what happened was it suffered an explosion while preparing to fire a dummy torpedo during the exercise. The leakage of high test peroxide, or HTP, from one of their Type 65 torpedoes was believed to have been the cause of the explosion. The explosion completely destroyed the first three compartments, the first three probably the first third or so of the sub, and 123 of the 118 crew ended up being alive in the ninth compartment all the way at the back when the submarine went to the seafloor, but they subsequently suffocated.
Oh God, I'm sorry, man, but that stuff just friggin' creeps. I can't think of a worse way to go.
Oh, you ready to get more creepy? When they were searching for the sub, they could hear them banging on the hull with wrenches.
Oh man, that's fucking that's terrible. I'll never sleep. I'll never sleep.
And then eventually they suffocated, and the compartment flooded. Actually, the seal finally gave way, and they found handwritten notes on the walls and on scraps of paper.
That I remember hearing, that they had time to write their loved ones.
Yep. Yeah.
Ugh.
Unbelievable.
That's why I don't. That's why I don't join the Navy. Why I didn't join the Navy, buddy? Shit like that.
I could never have been a submariner. No way. No way. No way.
Yeah, it's not. No way does it happen. No way do I get into a can in the middle. I mean, I'll tell you what, and it's not because it's insane. I mean, I think that guys who were submariners, I have a lot of respect for them. My cousin was worked on a submarine, and he now works for my cousin was he works now for in New Jersey. He works for one of the nuclear power plants, but he was a submariner, and I got nothing but respect for that guy. It takes a lot of balls to get onto those friggin' things.
And then to stay on them for months at a time,
and then to I said I wouldn't get into the creepiness, but just because I brought him up, there is a story that he has told about. They would do sonar recordings of the ocean floor for like UNC, people, they would get, hey, we got all of our stuff done. Can we do this sonar readings for colleges? Well, this is back in the 80s, before they had all the sonar net buoys were civilian accessible. And so they would do sonar readings of the ocean floor, and he said they would find animals. They would get like biological readbacks of I'm sure it was like giant squid and stuff like that, but massive animals on the ocean floor that just would like creep out the guys on the sub. They were like, "Oh God, that thing's only like 300 feet below us." It was like, oh, it was like that would be enough for me. I'd be like, no, there's no need for an animal twice half the length of the sub to be around us. There's no need for that. Let's talk about one more. We'll talk about the K-129 Gulf II. The K-129 submarine was one of what was called Project 629A, Strategic Ballistic Missile Submarines, in the Soviet Pacific Fleet. This one was actually a Soviet. They all became Russian. Much like the Kursk was Soviet to begin with, then turned Russian. But this one was just Russian. I'm sorry, this one was just Soviet. It sank on 8 March 1968 in the Pacific Ocean, causing the death of all 98 crew aboard. The K-129 was lost after leaving from Kamchatka on patrol mission in February of 1968. The submarine reported the position upon its test dive, but sent no further communications after it left for its test dive. After unsuccessful attempts made by Soviet naval authorities at Kamchatka to contact K-129, the Soviet naval headquarters announced that the K-129 was missing by the third week of March. The Soviet Navy conducted extensive search missions, but failed to locate the K-129. The submarine was later announced lost with all crew, and the wreckage of the K-129 was found by the USS Halibut northwest of Oahu at a depth of about 16,000 feet.
Wow.
On August 1968. The cause of the accident is still unknown. They have no idea what happened. The thing went to go dive and then just never came out of it, and it is so far down that they have no way of knowing what actually happened. They just know that everyone's dead because that happened in 68. I mean, even if they survived it, you ain't surviving since 1968.
For too long. Yeah.
Those are 4 ships that is sunk, and there was no incident between, it wasn't the U.S. caused the sinking of a Soviet sub or the Soviets caused. I mean, just the fact that we were in this race underwater maybe led to a lot of these things going to sea when they weren't prepared to, or, not being thoroughly vetted for safety, but accidents happen. In 1993, though, this was something that actually was an incident that happened between the two. In 1993, following the fall of the Soviet Union, the U.S. was massively worried about what was going to happen with the Russian Federation after the fall of the Soviet Union. They had all these nuclear weapons. Nobody was in charge of anything. There was a lot of stress and worry in the U.S. intelligence community, which led us to take some chances that we normally would not have. And so in 1993, the U.S. Navy nuclear submarine, the USS Baton Rouge, collided with the Russian Navy submarine B-276 Kostroma. The United States claimed to just be recovering intelligence gathering submerged devices from the ocean floor in international waters, but the Russians claimed that the two subs were in a cat and mouse game being played out, and when the incident happened, and the U.S. denied it, but other Western countries have verified that the Russians are probably telling the truth. It seems like our sub was following far too close to this, Russian submarine, trying to figure out what they're doing, and there was a collision of the two shit. And then that's how close are you friggin'
I mean, you have to be close.
Yeah, to collide. Both submarines sustained damage. Thankfully, 0 casualties were reported. But God, how much chances are you taking? First of all, the Russians claim that these guys were within their area of the waters. They were in international waters. The U.S. says, no, we were in international waters, but the U.S. definition of international waters is different from the Russians. The U.S. uses a port of call, straight line distance one, where the Russians use a straight line distance from land. So there's all kinds of different international
nuance
waters.
To it, yeah.
And sounds like, in my opinion, sounds like they were playing the cat and mouse game of tracking and chasing each other. Which is it's not aggressive. They've been doing it with each other for years. There's plenty of stories of it. This just happened to be the U.S. were so worried about finding out what was going on because of the fall of the Soviet Union and all these nuclear subs were out there that they just got a little too close. And this collision happened. And the sad thing is it happened twice that year. And the U.S. had to really eat some crow.
Yeah, back off a little bit.
Yeah, back off, guys. Chill out.
Yeah.
So since then... after the Cold War ended, you kind of really don't hear much about submarines anymore. But Andrew, what is the modern day submarines mission, and how things going nowadays with submarines?
Sure. So obviously, the U.S. and its allies, and Russia and its allies, have large fleets of submarines. The modern sub is a multi-role platform. It can conduct both overt and covert operations in peacetime. It can act as a deterrent as well as for surveillance operations and information gathering. In wartime, or low intensity conflicts, subs can be used for a variety of things. They include surveillance and information gathering, as I just said, data communication, data collection, landing of special operations forces. I think one of the more recent examples of this is during U.S. operations in Somalia. They were used to insert SEALs.
The famous things where the SEALs arrive and all the news media are there to film them.
Yep.
Those SEALs were launched from a submarine.
Yeah. They also are used to attack land targets. The first cruise missile fired from a sub in the Gulf War was the USS Louisville. It was the first missile fired against Iraqi targets in January of 1991.
It's the first Gulf War, obviously.
Yep.
Yeah.
And still being used today to strike targets in Iraq and other places where we feel the need to blow something up. And it can also be used to protect task forces in merchant shipping and denial of sea areas to an enemy.
Yeah, I think the denial of sea areas to the enemy is a big one.
Yep.
I think one of the things, not that, all right, our U.S. Navy is I'll be willing to say that at this point in the world, our modern day U.S. Navy is probably the most effective, unmatched Navy in the history of, we can talk about the British Navy back in the day, the Spanish Armada, but modern day U.S. Navy is unmatched. We dominate the waters of the ocean. We do. It's unbalanced in how much we control. The Navy is they just dominate the entire world. And so using them as denying, there's no one that would go into an area that has the ability for subs to move about it that can't think that the U.S. subs aren't out there watching them. They are. It's unfortunate that we have to be the big bad guys, but we are. We're the big bad guys, and I don't feel bad about it. But it's just what we are. It's how we.
We're the most powerful nation on the planet. Sometimes you have to kick a little ass with underwater.
Militarily, I think we're the most.
Militarily, yeah.
I think financially, China is might be kicking our ass right now. But But having said that, the history we could go into, and we probably will again in the future. We're going to talk. We'll do some shows on specific submarine incidents that happened, but this is just a one over the world of submarines and some of the stories that have gone on, and it's really a portion of warfare that I think a lot of people forget about, but it was so important. It pretty much dominated the 20th century.
Yeah, and actually, and if you want to cover this on a later show, because it is a really cool thing, can I share my favorite kind of submarine
please.
reference?
Let's hear it.
Submarines actually have made their way into everyday or almost everyday conversation. If you ever hear somebody say, I can neither confirm nor deny, they're actually making reference to something that involves submarines. Specifically, there was a recovery vessel called the Hughes Glomar Explorer that was built and run by the CIA for something called Project Azorian.
That's the one that lifted the Scorpion, isn't it?
Yep. It was a Soviet sub that they tried to lift.
Yeah, that's right.
Yep.
That's right.
So in 1975, they did this, and a reporter actually found out about it or heard a rumor of it. So they fired a freedom of information request about it. And the letter they got back was as follows. Mr. Duckett, who was a lawyer with the CIA, has determined that in the interest of national security, involvement by the U.S. government in activities which are the subject matter of your request can neither be confirmed nor denied.
Nice. I love that phrase, too.
Yep. It gets you out of all sorts of trouble.
Gets you out of it. It just pretty much tells you, I'm not telling you shit.
Exactly.
There's a really good documentary on that Glomar Explorer
is.
thing. Thank you. I'm glad you brought it up. I will link that in the show notes page also, because that's a really interesting how they designed it. I think it was designed off of the coast of San Diego or LA or something like that. It was
a big, basically maritime crane that they could just drop straight down and control as it fell with rudders and propellers. It was
and they
a cool
lifted
piece of
they lifted the sub up into the heart of this ship without anyone seeing it, and were like checking everything inside the sub out as they sailed back to port, and no one knowing that they had picked up a sub off the bottom of the ocean floor.
Exactly. It was just damn cool.
Yeah, it is. I'm glad you brought that up. The Glomar Explorer thing is pretty cool, and that thing has been used for a bunch of stuff since then.
All sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that's right. I forgot about that one. That's a good idea. Yeah, we'll put that in there. I'll put the show notes page. That's a cool story. Anything else?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that'll do it.
Well, guys, that'll bring us to the end of this episode of Changing Hearts and Minds. It's a long one. We got a good hour and 27 minutes. Maybe I'll break this. I might break this into 2 episodes.
I think this is a twosie for you.
This might be a twosie. That's great too. So I want to thank you, Andrew, for coming on and spending your time your Sunday morning with us again. And as always, man, we get into it. It's a worthy friggin' hour and a half of information that I can split into 2 hours of shows.
Yes,
fantastic.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Andrew, and all of you guys out there. Remember, don't take no shit, man. Keep it real. Do your Press the Lee Bear, and we'll see you guys next week.
Change Your POV and all of its shows can help and heal and even educate. We want you to help us help others. Visit our Patreon page at www.patreon.com/changeyourpov. Become a patron of our network and our mission.